It had been just over 2 years since the phone call that changed everything. I expected a simple holiday greeting from my old friend Luke and his wife Sarah. We hadn't seen each other over the festive period for the first time in 2 decades. There was a tragic reason for the distance this year. Luke's mother had passed away suddenly just a week before Christmas. He and his family were completely devastated by the loss. He traded his usual nights at the pub for a quiet, solitary Christmas. When Sarah's name appeared on my screen, I thought they were finally reaching out. But Luke wasn't on the other end of the line. Sarah told me through tears that Luke had gone missing. It wasn't just his absence that terrified her, it was the things he said before he left. She said he had started talking about seeing an angel. My heart sank as she described his sudden religious obsession. When she asked where he was going, Luke told her she wouldn't understand. He told her he was going to talk to the angel one last time. Sarah was too stunned to stop him as he drove away into the winter storm. When she asked if I knew what he meant, I felt a cold knot tighten in my chest. I told her I had a very good idea of where he had gone. I promised her I would drive all the way to Scotland to bring him home myself. We agreed not to call the police to avoid getting him in legal or psychiatric trouble. But the real danger wasn't the law, it was the brutal winter weather. To understand why he went there, I had to look back 20 years. We were just kids, 21 years old and full of terrible ideas. We had decided to go camping at Loch Braden 2 days after Christmas. We wanted a white Christmas and an excuse to get drunk around a warm fire. It didn't snow, but the cold was biting and the air smelled of roasting chestnuts. While we were passing around drinks and spliffs, Luke remained unusually sober. He grew quieter and quieter as the night wore on, seemingly on a different wavelength. Eventually, he just stood up and walked off into the darkness alone. We called out to him, but he only replied that he was going for a walk. An hour passed, and the laughter died away as we realized he wasn't coming back. We grabbed our torches and went searching for him in the freezing woods. We eventually found him standing perfectly still in a clearing, looking up at the sky. Later that night, as we huddled in our tents, Luke spoke in a voice that was eerily sincere. He told us that he had seen an angel out there in the dark. We all just laughed, assuming it was the booze or the lack of sleep. But Luke never wavered. That moment became the foundation of his entire life. Now, 20 years later, I was driving through the same frozen landscape to find him. I reached Loch Braden by mid-afternoon, the wind howling across the desolate water. I trekked toward our old campsite and found exactly what I feared, a single green tent. Inside the empty tent, I saw Luke's Bible resting on a rolled-up sleeping bag. I spent an hour calling his name, but the only answer was the whistling wind. Darkness was fully creeping in when I finally heard heavy footsteps crunching through the snow. A figure emerged from the blackness, his face hollowed out by grief and something far more dangerous. Luke didn't look happy to see me. He looked like a man who had finally found what he was looking for. I knew I had to tell him the truth about that night 20 years ago, but I was terrified of what it would do to him. Luke stepped closer and whispered, "He's coming back for me tonight." I reached for my pocket, feeling the weight of a secret that could either save him or destroy us both. I stepped out of the car and felt the biting Scottish wind tear through my heavy winter coat immediately. My boots crunched over the thin layer of crusty snow as I began the trek toward the old shoreline. Memories of our drunken youth here 20 years ago flickered in my mind like a dying campfire. I knew exactly where he would be because that spot was the altar of his transformation. A flash of dark green fabric appeared through the trees, marking the location of a lone tent. I approached the campsite slowly, noticing the lack of smoke from the stone-ringed fire pit. I pulled back the tent flap and saw only a rolled-up sleeping bag and a small leather-bound Bible. The silence of the woods felt heavy, amplified by the distant howling of the winter gale. I gathered some dry pine needles and fallen branches to start a fire while I waited. A sharp snap of a twig behind me made me spin around, my heart hammering against my ribs. Luke emerged from the darkness like a ghost, his face gaunt and his eyes hollowed by grief. He stopped 10 feet away and asked me with a raspy voice who had told me where to find him. I told him Sarah was worried, hoping the mention of his wife would soften his hard expression. Luke shook his head and declared that he wouldn't leave until he spoke with the angel again. He explained that he needed to give the celestial being a message for his recently deceased mother. Seeing his desperation made the weight of my secret feel like a physical leaden coil in my gut. We sat in a long, uncomfortable silence while the wind whistled through the nearby pines. I cleared my throat and asked him what he would do if the angel was never real to begin with. Luke let out a dry, mirthless laugh and told me I was just another unbeliever trying to ground him. I reached into my inner pocket and pulled out a small, empty plastic vial I had kept for years. I told him that on that night 20 years ago, I had slipped something into his drink. Luke's smile faltered, replaced by a look of utter bewilderment as he stared at the vial. I confessed that it was liquid LSD, a prank that I thought would just make him laugh. The color drained from his face until his skin looked as pale as the surrounding snow. I explained how the light of the angel was likely just the moon reflecting off a bird's wings while he was tripping. He stood up abruptly, backing away from the fire and screaming that I was a liar. I reminded him how he had complained that the fire was too bright and his skin felt like it was buzzing. The reality of his entire life's foundation beginning to crumble was visible in the way his hands shook. He hissed that I had stolen his salvation and replaced his God with a chemical lie. I told him I had carried this guilt for 2 decades and couldn't let him die out here for a hallucination. Luke began to pace in tight, frantic circles around the fire pit, muttering to himself. He suddenly stopped and looked at me with a coldness that I had never seen in my friend before. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up as the atmosphere turned predatory. He picked up a heavy, jagged piece of firewood and gripped it until his knuckles turned white. I whispered his name, begging him to just sit down and breathe through the shock. He let out a guttural roar that echoed across the frozen loch like the scream of a wounded animal. Without warning, he lunged across the flames, the wood raised high above his head. I scrambled backward, tripping over a tree root and falling hard onto the frozen earth. I looked up to see him towering over me, the silhouette of a man who had lost his soul. I raised my arms to protect my face as I saw the first blow beginning its descent. The crack of wood meeting bone echoed through the trees, followed by a sickening silence. The heavy silence following the blow felt like a physical weight pressing down on the frozen campsite. Luke groaned softly as he clutched his head, the reality of the narrator's confession beginning to sink into his fractured mind. He looked up with eyes that no longer held the light of religious fervor but the heat of a betrayed man. "You took it from me," he rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering across the ice. The narrator backed away, the heavy branch still trembling in his numb, gloved hands. Luke struggled to his feet, his movements erratic and fueled by a surge of adrenaline-fueled rage. Every memory of the golden angel was now being overridden by the image of a secret vial of liquid. He realized the divinity he worshipped was nothing more than a chemical trick played by his only friend. Luke lunged forward, his fingers clawing at the air as if trying to tear the truth out of the narrator. The 2 men collided, tumbling into the freezing slush beside the smoldering logs. A guttural scream erupted from Luke's throat, echoing across the frozen surface of Loch Braden. The narrator felt Luke's hands tighten around his throat, the grip strengthened by a decade of delusion. The winter air bit into their lungs, but neither man felt the sub-zero temperatures anymore. With a frantic heave, the narrator managed to roll them over, pinning Luke into the bank of snow. "I did it to save you from yourself, Luke," the narrator cried out over the howling wind. Luke spat at him, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He began to laugh, a high-pitched, manic sound that made the narrator's blood run colder than the lock. "There's no angel here, only the cold," Luke whispered, his voice suddenly calm and terrifying. He reached into his heavy coat and pulled out a small, serrated hunting knife. The narrator scrambled backward, his boots slipping on the slick, icy rocks of the shore. Luke rose slowly, the knife held low and steady, his movements now precise and dangerous. The weight of years of friendship was dissolving into a single moment of lethal intent. "I loved you like a brother, Luke," the narrator whispered, his voice breaking. "Brothers don't build houses out of lies," Luke replied, stepping into the narrator's personal space. A sudden crack of a nearby branch caused both men to freeze in place. Something large was moving through the undergrowth, heavy and indifferent to their presence. For a moment, the personal vendetta was eclipsed by the raw threat of the wild. But Luke's gaze quickly returned to the narrator, the knife still clutched firmly in his hand. The narrator realized there would be no reasoning with a man who had lost his soul. Luke lunged again, this time with a downward strike aimed at the narrator's chest. The narrator dodged, the blade slicing through his thick winter parka with a sickening tear. He swung the stone with all his remaining strength, catching Luke squarely on the shoulder. Luke stumbled, the knife falling from his grasp and disappearing into the deep snow. Both men were now gasping for air, their bodies pushed to the absolute limit of endurance. The narrator looked at the tent, the thin nylon walls providing no real protection from the madness. He knew he had to leave, to run until the Highlands were a distant memory. "You can't run from what you did," Luke screamed after him, his voice cracking with hysteria. The narrator didn't look back, his footsteps heavy and rhythmic in the crunching snow. Behind him, the laughter started again, echoing off the mountains like the cry of a dying animal. As the narrator reached the ridge, he saw a black SUV parked far below, its headlights cutting through the dawn. He realized then that Luke wasn't the only one who had been followed into the frozen wilderness. A figure stepped out of the car holding a device that glowed with an unnatural, sterile light. The chapter ends as the figure looks directly up toward the narrator's hiding spot, a slow smile spreading across their face. The memory of that chilling smile in the Highlands faded as the scene shifted to a much colder, more clinical winter in Seattle. Allison looked over at Chris, who seemed more relaxed than he had been in months. They were heading to a luxury glamping retreat called Mother's Love, promised to be a sanctuary for child-free couples. Chris had found the invitation online through a private medical forum he frequented. Allison felt a slight prickle of doubt as the GPS led them deeper into the unplowed backroads of the Snoqualmie forest. The luxury SUV finally pulled into a cleared gravel lot surrounded by high, dark fences. A woman in a sharp, slate-gray winter coat stepped out from a small glass booth to greet them. She introduced herself as Elena, the lead coordinator for this weekend's enlightenment session. Behind her, a series of geodesic domes glowed like giant paper lanterns against the white ground. Chris took Allison's hand, his palms sweaty despite the sub-zero temperatures. Elena led them toward the largest dome, which served as the communal dining hall. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of sandalwood and expensive essential oils. 4 other couples sat around a circular table, all dressed in similar neutral-tone loungewear. No one was talking. They were all focused on a small, dark liquid in their glass flutes. Elena took her place at the head of the circle and gestured for Allison and Chris to sit. She began to speak about the burden of the future and the weight of legacy. Her words were smooth, arguing that the greatest gift one could give the earth was their own absence. Chris nodded along as if he had heard these arguments many times before. Allison noticed that the walls of the dome were lined with medical diagrams rather than art. One diagram featured a surgical procedure that looked far more invasive than a simple checkup. The dinner served was meager, raw vegetables and a thin, bitter broth. Chris leaned in and told Allison that the fast was necessary for the cleansing tomorrow. "What cleansing, Chris?" she asked, but he only squeezed her arm too hard. Elena stood up again, holding a stack of legal-looking documents in her hands. She explained that the retreat was a commitment to the final generation philosophy. Allison realized that every couple here was being asked to sign away their future fertility. It wasn't just a lifestyle choice, it was a radical, permanent pact. She stood up to leave, but Chris grabbed her wrist, his face a mask of desperation. "We talked about this, Allison. We don't want children anyway," he hissed. "I never said I wanted this," she shouted, the sound echoing in the silent dome. The other couples turned as one, their expressions vacant and synchronized. Elena didn't look angry. She looked disappointed, like a mother at a wayward child. "Take her to the quiet room so she can reflect on her selfishness," Elena said softly. Two large men in white medical scrubs appeared from the shadows behind the kitchen area. Allison backed away, but her boots slipped on a patch of spilled broth. Chris didn't move to help her, he just looked down at the signature line on the paper. The men grabbed her by the shoulders, their grip like iron through her winter parka. She kicked and screamed, but the thick fabric of the dome seemed to swallow the sound. Elena watched them go, then picked up a pen and handed it to Chris with a smile. Outside, the wind howled, burying the retreat in a fresh layer of silent, suffocating snow. As Allison was forced into the quiet room, she saw a row of surgical tools laid out on a sterile tray. The door slammed shut, and the last thing she saw was Elena's face through the small viewing window, nodding in approval. Allison hammered her fists against the heavy wooden door of the yurt, but the latch remained firmly locked from the outside. She pressed her ear against the cold wood, hearing only the distant, rhythmic chanting of the other guests outside. Turning around, she noticed the space was no longer a cozy glamping tent, but a sterile, makeshift surgical suite. A stainless steel table sat in the center of the room, covered in a crisp white paper sheet that rustled in the draft. On a side cart, several surgical instruments were laid out in a neat, terrifying row. Allison lunged for the small viewing window, seeing Chris standing in the snow with a vacant, glazed expression. She screamed his name until her throat burned, but he didn't even flinch toward her voice. Elena appeared behind Chris, placing a hand on his shoulder like a puppeteer claiming her prize. The door latch clicked back open, and Elena stepped inside, followed by two masked attendants in heavy winter coats. Elena explained that the gift of Mother Nature was the liberation from the burden of future bloodlines. Allison realized then that the tea they had been drinking was laced with a powerful sedative. Elena spoke of a world cured of the human plague, starting with those who were enlightened enough to visit. The attendants moved forward, grabbing Allison's arms with a strength that felt like iron bands. She kicked out, her boot connecting with the metal table and sending a tray of gauze flying across the floor. Elena simply watched, her expression unchanging as if she were observing a difficult child. They forced Allison down onto the cold paper of the exam table, the sound of her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. One attendant pulled a syringe from a sterilized pouch, the needle glinting under the fluorescent hum. "Where's Chris?" Allison sobbed, her strength beginning to fail as the initial dose of the tea took hold. Elena leaned over her, whispering that Chris had already accepted his gift in the other tent. The realization that her partner had betrayed her body for this radical ideology was more painful than any needle. Elena stated that childbearing was a selfish act of environmental destruction that they were here to prevent. Allison's limbs felt like lead, her muscles refusing to obey the commands of her racing mind. The second attendant began to prep a chemical solution, the smell of rubbing alcohol filling the cramped space. Outside, the chanting grew louder, a haunting melody about returning the womb to the earth. Elena picked up a small, specialized medical device that looked more like an instrument of torture than medicine. Allison tried to speak, but only a dry, raspy wheeze escaped her throat. She looked at Elena and saw not a doctor, but a predator hiding behind the mask of environmentalism. The attendants began to strap her legs into the stirrups, the leather belts creaking in the silence. Lena explained that this procedure was permanent, ensuring no genetic pollution would ever leave this camp. Allison's vision started to vignette, the edges of the room turning into a bottomless black ink. Suddenly, the sound of a heavy branch snapping echoed from the woods, momentarily breaking Elena's focus. A low growl, far too deep for a human, vibrated through the floorboards of the platform. The chanting outside stopped abruptly, replaced by a confused murmur and the sound of running footsteps. Elena signaled to one attendant to check the perimeter, her professional calm finally showing a crack of irritation. Allison felt a surge of adrenaline fight against the sedative, her fingers grasping for the edge of the metal table. A scream ripped through the night outside, followed by the sound of tearing fabric and heavy breathing. The attendant at the door was suddenly yanked backward into the darkness by an unseen force. Elena reached for the scalpel, her face twisting with a desperate need to finish what she started. Allison rolled off the table, the stirrups clattering as she crashed onto the floor in a heap of tangled limbs. As the yurt wall gave way entirely, a massive, dark silhouette loomed over them, and Allison realized the bear from the legends was no myth. The morning light felt thin and cold as I stepped out of the glamping tent, searching for any sign of Chris. My head throbbed with a rhythmic ache, a brutal reminder of the free-flowing alcohol from the night before. After only a few steps, the world tilted, and I had to lean against a rough pine tree to steady myself. I doubled over and retched into the snow, the sound of my own sickness echoing through the silent woods. Once I wiped my mouth, I noticed several campers standing nearby watching me with expressions of pure ice. I tried to offer a weak, apologetic smile, but they didn't return the gesture, instead turning to whisper to one another. I called out for Chris, asking anyone if they had seen where he went, but my voice was met with total silence. The friendly atmosphere of the previous 2 days had evaporated, replaced by a thick, palpable hostility. I marched toward the main conference hall, noticing a cluster of men sitting in the waiting area through the glass. Before I could reach the door, one of the organizers intercepted me, her face a mask of stern disapproval. She insisted we return to my tent to speak in private, refusing to answer any questions in the open air. Inside the tent, the truth finally spilled out like a jagged shard of glass. Chris had already undergone the procedure. He had been the first one in line that morning, eager to fulfill what they called the gift of Mother Nature. The organizer told me Chris was being kept in a separate recovery tent because my presence was deemed spiritually toxic. I stood up and screamed at her, calling them all psychos for preying on a man in the middle of a mental breakdown. I told her they weren't his friends, but vultures who had tricked him into a permanent solution for a temporary problem. She didn't blink or argue, she simply told me to pack my things and leave the premises immediately. As I stuffed my clothes into my bag, I could hear a low, rhythmic chanting starting somewhere outside the tent. I stepped outside with my gear, and the atmosphere turned from cold to violently aggressive. A group of men moved in close, their faces inches from mine, screaming obscenities that made my blood run cold. Women I had shared vegan curry with just the night before stood by, smiling as the men harassed me. One of the men shoved me hard, sending me stumbling backward into the frozen dirt. A small rock whizzed past my ear, followed by another that struck my shoulder with a dull thud. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing what I could, and sprinted toward the parking area where my car was parked. The crowd followed at a distance, their jeers and insults echoing through the trees like a pack of hunting wolves. My hands were shaking so violently that I fumbled the keys twice before finally unlocking the driver's side door. I threw my bags into the passenger seat and slammed the door, locking it just as the first of them reached the car. I looked out the window and saw Chris standing at the edge of the woods, supported by 2 other men. He didn't wave or try to stop them, he just watched me go with eyes that looked completely empty. I felt like I had failed him, like I had driven him right into the jaws of a cult and then abandoned him there. The drive back to Seattle was a blur of white lines and gray skies. the heater in the car doing nothing to thaw the ice in my chest. In the weeks that followed, I tried to call Chris dozens of times, but my number had been blocked on every platform. Our mutual friends told me he was doing great and that he had found a new family who truly understood him. I hated how they used the language of choice to mask the systematic radicalization of a man who was already hurting. I missed the old Chris, the one who would get sushi and talk about movies, not the one who measured his life in parts per million. One night I received a strange, anonymous package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a small piece of dried elk jerky and a note that simply read, "The Earth remembers." I realized then that they hadn't just taken Chris, they were still watching me, making sure I kept their secret. I wonder every day if he ever thinks about that night by the fire when I told him there was hope for a future with a family. As I stood at my window, I saw a familiar car parked across the street, its headlights flickering twice as if sending a signal to someone inside my building. The cold Swedish air bit into my skin as I stood by the window, watching the mysterious car linger across the street. My mind drifted back to the winter of my 23rd year, shortly after a medical diagnosis ended my military career. I had invited my old friends on a winter camping trip, but only Var was brave enough to accept the challenge. Var was a man of volatile reputation, a wolf by name and nature, who often found himself on the wrong side of the law. We drove deep into the wilderness, seeking the isolation that only a frozen forest could provide. We set up our camp near a frozen clearing, confident that the bears would be deep in their winter hibernation. The silence of the first night was shattered by a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the tent floor. Outside, a massive brown bear was tearing through our supplies, its breath visible in the freezing air. We burst out of the tent, screaming and waving our arms to intimidate the starving predator. As the bear lunged forward in a false charge, I stumbled backward into a hidden root and felt a sickening pop in my ankle. Var successfully deployed the bear mace, sending the blinded animal retreating back into the darkness. I spent the rest of the night shivering in the tent, my ankle swelling to twice its normal size. At daybreak, Var announced he would hike to the nearest road to find a shop and medical supplies. I waited alone for hours, clutching the bear mace and listening to every snap of a twig in the woods. Var returned much sooner than expected, his backpack bulging with an unusual amount of items. He dumped the contents onto the tent floor, vodka, cigarettes, elk jerky, and a mountain of various medications. I noticed several boxes of anti-allergy pills and antacids that we clearly didn't need. When I asked where he got the money for all of this, Var's face twisted into a guilty scowl. He admitted that he hadn't bought the items at all but had taken them by force after a dispute with the shopkeeper. My heart sank as he described beating an elderly woman until she was motionless on the floor. Var argued that he did it for me, claiming that the woman refused to give him the emergency supplies we needed. I realized then that my friend's loyalty was a warped and dangerous thing. Var sat in the corner of the tent and began to drink the stolen vodka, his eyes glazing over with a cold fury. A small plane began to circle overhead, its engine humming a low, persistent warning. I waved my arms at the aircraft, hoping for a rescue that didn't involve Var's violent path. Suddenly, a man emerged from the tree line, his face obscured by a thick scarf and a shotgun held firmly in his grip. Var saw the intruder and instantly bolted, disappearing into the thicket without a backward glance. I tried to follow, but my injured ankle gave way and I collapsed face first into the freezing powder. A thunderous boom echoed through the valley as the man fired a shot into the air. I rolled onto my back, staring up at the barrel of the gun as the man approached me. I begged him not to shoot, explaining that I was injured and had no part in the robbery. The man, whose name was Oscar, demanded to know where the animal who attacked his wife had gone. Another shot rang out as Oscar fired toward the direction Var had fled, though he hit nothing but snow. Oscar looked at me with a hollow expression and told me his wife was fighting for her life in a hospital. He made me an offer. He would spare my life if I helped the police hunt down Var. I agreed, knowing that Var's actions had forever severed the bond of our friendship. We left the tent and the stolen supplies behind, ghost-like relics in the moonlight. As we drove away in Oscar's truck, I looked back at the dark woods where Var was hiding. I knew that my testimony would send Var to prison for a long time, and I felt no remorse. But as we reached the main road, the truck's radio crackled to life with a frantic report of a second, much larger predator seen stalking near the village. The radio in the truck continued to hum with the news of the predator, but the real monster was sitting right next to me. Var returned from his supply run with a bag far too heavy for the few coins he carried. Bottles of vodka, cartons of cigarettes, and a chaotic mess of medications spilled across the frozen ground. I stared at the anti-allergy pills and antacids, wondering why he would ever think we needed such a specific hoard. When I pressed him for the truth, his face twisted into that familiar, guilty mask I had seen 1,000 times since childhood. He finally snapped, admitting that the shopkeeper refused his insufficient payment, leading to a violent outburst. Var had beaten an innocent woman unconscious just to secure a few bottles of cheap spirits and snacks. He claimed he did it for us, as if a brutal assault could ever be justified by my sprained ankle. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of a friendship that was rapidly disintegrating. I watched a small plane circle high above the tree line, wondering if help or doom was looking down at us. In a moment of sheer desperation, I waved my arms at the sky, a silent plea for someone to witness our location. Var ignored my efforts, choosing instead to drown his nerves in the stolen vodka while the cold bit into our bones. Suddenly, Var stood up with wobbly legs, declaring it was time to move before the law caught up. Behind him, a figure emerged from the pines, clad in thick wool and carrying a double-barrel shotgun. Var caught my expression and bolted into the thicket, leaving me behind in the snow. I tried to follow, but my ankle gave way, sending a blinding white flash of agony through my entire body. A thunderous boom echoed through the woods as the first shot was fired, shattering the winter silence. I rolled onto my back, panting, as the hunter closed the distance between us. The barrel of the shotgun was a dark, hollow eye staring directly into my soul. I screamed that I wasn't the one, that it was my friend who had gone to the shop. The man, whose name was Oscar, looked at me with a cold, judging fury that made my heart stop. I began to pray, reciting words I hadn't uttered since my childhood, preparing for the end. To my utter shock, Oscar lowered the weapon and extended a rough, calloused hand toward me. He told me that if I wanted to live, I would help the police find the coward who had hurt his wife. I agreed without a second thought, the fear of the shotgun replaced by an overwhelming sense of duty. We walked toward his truck, leaving the wreckage of our campsite and my old life behind in the darkness. At the shop, I saw the paramedics treating a woman whose face was bruised by Var's senseless rage. I told the police everything, mapping out Var's habits and the likely paths he would take to escape. Var was captured within 48 hours, shivering and pathetic in a ditch miles away. He was sentenced to 6 years, a price far too small for the terror he inflicted on that family. We haven't spoken since that day, and I intend to keep it that way for the rest of my life. Sometimes I wonder if he will come looking for me when he is finally free, seeking some warped version of revenge. If he does, he will find that I am no longer the helpless friend he left in the snow. These stories of winter are more than just tales of cold. They are warnings about the people we think we know. Whether it is an angel in the Highlands or a cult in Seattle, the wilderness strips us down to our truest selves. I have found peace in the quiet of my home, far from the echoes of the frozen woods. The predators have been caged, and the shadows of the past are finally beginning to recede. I hope that everyone who hears these stories understands that survival is a choice we make every day. Thank you for listening to my journey through the dark, and may your own paths always be clear. This is the end of the frozen echoes and the beginning of a long-awaited spring.